Hey, welcome back, everybody, to another roundtable of the None of Our Businesses YouTube show and podcast. With me, as always, I've got Charlie Zigman and AJ Wheeler. Hey, guys.
How's it going, man?
Glad we can be here. And of course, Ethan, our producer, is diligently making sure we don't say anything too stupid and recording as always. So let's kick it off. What do we have to talk about this week?
All right. The first article I thought I'd bring up this week was actually in the Harvard Business Review. It was an article by Matt Allen. And so he's a professor at Harvard. And about 7 years ago, he started doing a kind of a capstone project for his business students and entrepreneurship students. So the idea was for them to come up with basically a pitch to move their family business forward into like the next thing. And he kind of wanted a holistic view of the family businesses that were in his class. And so what he was expecting to do was very academic, kind of that the traditional business plan with a new idea to take this older family business and move it online or to a direct kind of to consumer basis or something like that. And what he got instead was a very personal kind of connection with the students with their families. And so I get the feeling from the article, a lot of these children were first generation Americans, and they couldn't understand like why their parents were so risk averse or why it was so difficult, why they weren't in their lives as much as they were. And through kind of the lens of the family business, they were able to kind of identify and come to the realization of why like the family was so risk averse, or why the father, it was so difficult to get a hold of the father because he was working 12 hours a day at this family business and trying to make it a success. And so the key points that came out of it that he kind of mentions here, I think we can kind of reflect on, but I think they kind of hold true, not just for a family business, but for business overall, and they're kind of large ideas. So the thing that he kind of thinks of it as a family business homework assignment is what he calls it. So the first thing he says is consider potential, not yet experienced events or situations that are likely to disrupt or defer significantly from your understanding of how things are working currently in the business. And then by discussing together what's those potential situations or events that will likely cause difficulty for the family and the business, and then create an interaction for the family to expect those expected ones, kind of like a disaster plan for the business. And then the other thing he talks about are like life events. And I don't think it's any different from when, people get into retirement age in a firm or in a closely held business, looking to the next person and making everybody around it feel like that's the correct choice to be partner tracked or to take over the business. And so they talk about like a death in the family. And so I was thinking from you guys, are you guys, kind of agree with his sentiments there? Or is there anything that maybe he left out about, or is there something different from family business, like a family business where it's basically siblings working together versus a traditional business structure that we're probably used to?
I think that's really interesting because I think that it always does boil back down to kind of who the key stakeholders are. And a lot of times when you've worked in a company that isn't even family for a long time, you find that the key personalities often drive the culture and how that business really operates. And so it's interesting to have this kind of honed in on the family element when the same issue kind of applies at a bunch of businesses that just have long tenured people who have been there for a long time and have really shaped the environment. And so I do think that, it's a really interesting topic, and I could definitely see how those kind of familial issues could really drive how a business gets operated. And so, I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the psychology behind what the author was talking about was really important, and I think transcends just the family business dynamic. And I think that he was able to explore a particular kind of psychology of how people interact with each other in the family business context. But I could definitely relate to it outside of the family business context. I've known people who've operated family businesses, but I've never personally operated a family business. I guess you could say I operate my own business and my wife's sometimes involved. So maybe that's like a family business, but I didn't grow up in a family business like many people might have. And so the psychology that I'm talking about, the author was referring and explaining that um, that the students who were part of the family business, having to do as part of their coursework some research into their family business and ask some deep questions, caused them to come to a different kind of understanding of events and the business and their parents or their family members that they didn't have before, because they were approaching things from a different angle than just their same old way of doing things, right? And in that discussion, the author talked a lot about how people working together, or people who are together in any kind of unit, develop these kind of shared understandings of things. And even pointed out that it's not that everyone agrees with each other's understanding, but they know where the other person's coming from. They've had events that they've shared with each other, and so they know what the context and background is, and why some other people in an organization think the way they do. And I think that kind of dynamic we definitely see in other organizations. Charlie mentioned it, that you have other organizations that have people with long tenure, and it kind of starts to develop this same kind of thing that you sometimes see in family businesses, where the people who've had long tenure in a business almost become entitled in the business, right? Except for the most disciplined and hard-nosed businesses, which is actually pretty rare in my experience in the small business community. It's not that common to just boot somebody out because they're not a top performer. If they've been with the company for a long time, it's far more common for the small business operators to still try to find a place for them, try to work with that person, try to work around them a lot of times. And so a lot of these things that you think might be unique to a family business, I think Charlie probably has experienced this too. It's actually not that unique. That you see this in non-family businesses, where people who aren't really family members but are just tolerated and have been there forever. And so you end up kind of figuring out how you're going to work around them. And so I think that the lessons of how you get the efficiency and the meaning of getting to a common or an understood background with other people are applicable not only in the family business environment, but in other environments. And I'm just going to keep rambling because I have so much to say about this. I'm going to bridge this over to talking about finance professionals, because a common kind of one of the things that that has become a buzzword or a thing in the finance community and corporate finance is this idea of the business partner, the finance business partner. And there's even a business partnering institute out there for finance professionals who work in companies who have the roles of being so-called business partners. And I'm definitely not an expert in what they're all talking about and how, but what I've gleaned from listening to some of them and reading some of their materials is that what they're getting at in the context of business partnering is this idea that you have to work as a finance person, you have to work with business operators who don't have the same background and context and the same vocabulary and the same language that you do for business. And you've got to figure out how they're coming at whatever the business problem is in order to successfully partner with them. And so there's a lot being written and discussed right now among finance professionals about how you can do that well. And that's, I believe, what they mean by being a good business partner, being better business partners from a finance standpoint, is how can you learn to understand the business in the same way that your business partners, your operating partners, understand the business, and then therefore be able to serve them better, right? And so I think this, it's kind of, it may have seemed far-fetched from the title, but I actually made that clicked with me with reading this article that you brought up, AJ, was that when he was talking about ways of understanding and having this common understanding, and maybe you don't even agree with each other, but you know where the other person's coming from and where they got their understanding from. I think that is very relatable to a finance professional working in a company, trying to understand how their CEO thinks. And if you're like us, consultants that work in multiple companies, you're trying to understand that multiple times over, right? You're each client, you're looking at, well, how does each different CEO thinks? And that's exactly what I do. I mean, I spend a lot of time and effort really trying to learn and understand, how does the CEO, how do the other business leaders of this particular company or client think? And what is their context? What is their way of understanding, so that I can be a better service provider to them?
Well, and how can I cater my message so that they hear it in the way that I want them to hear it, right? How does their terminology kind of change how I might say whatever I would say, so that it comes across the most like what I'm trying to get them to hear? And so, yeah, I think it all kind of boils back down to communication. And it always kind of amazes me how much of accounting really does just boil back down to like, how effective of a communicator are you? And, yeah, how well can you share that idea? The other thing I thought was really interesting to kind of talk about is I'm not sure this is the right term, but the idea of like groupthink, the idea that like a group of people will come to a conclusion and learn to think about things in a certain way, and then until somebody else comes in from the outside and looks at something in a new perspective, then kind of challenges that paradigm. And so I think that's another factor that happens, that when something's been, when someone's been somewhere for so long, or if they're your father and they're running their business, you might not question something that you don't understand, because you trust that them or the organization as a whole has already handled that. But in reality, often it is the case that they haven't. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I was listening to what Ty was thinking, and what I got from the article was more about how when they actually talk, like the thing that got me, I think, and I was kind of on the psychological thinking about it, was once the kids talked to the parents that ran the business, they tended to understand where their parents were coming from better. And like, although like Ty said, you may not agree with the choice, at least they knew what the thinking was behind that choice. And so what I was thinking about was kind of those businesses that I've worked for, where you don't know where they're coming from. Like nothing is the discussion, or there's no discussion to be had. And you don't have basically an idea of where the decisions that impact you and the rest of the business are coming from. And how, I think if there was more clarity around that, or more kind of, transparency behind why certain decisions are made, or what's going on, or explaining the details of something a little bit more, I think there's a better understanding for everybody. And so I have definitely been a part of businesses where you're not privy to why decisions are made, and those are usually where the larger like businesses I would work for, where it just basically came down the line that this is how things run, as opposed to when you have a complete picture of what's going on, or understand at least why a decision was made. And so I thought it was interesting from that standpoint, where it was very like how deep and powerful and eye-opening, I guess, those discussions were with their parents, and how that seeing it clearly from their point of view.
Well, I thought I caught on to that too, and I thought what was ironic about that, or also then thinking about how that relates to non-family businesses, is that, yeah, these are family businesses. And so if we're saying that among family members, they don't actually understand where their own family members are coming from until they had these discussions. And then once they had these discussions, it was like eye-opening that they suddenly understood decisions. If that kind of lack of understanding among people trying to communicate to each other can happen among family members, it seemed, you would think, well, then it must be like, you must see that in spades among non-family members in traditional non-family businesses, right? And in small businesses where people aren't even related, and they don't have other kinds of shared experiences with each other, the gap there in understanding, you would think, would be even more.
Yeah, totally. The other thing that was the nature of the questions. I mean, asking deep questions seemed to lead to these kind of discussions that, unless you were having those type of, those deep questions, then you wouldn't be, getting down to the nitty gritty on those topics. And so I think that's another angle of why sometimes those types of things in small businesses don't end up happening, or those communications don't happen, is because the type of questions being asked aren't generic enough to elicit that kind of conversation. And so,
Well, one
So
of the big part of the articles, I think, or one of the big part of the articles what they were talking about was succession planning. And I think succession planning for any business is tough. I mean, I've been worked in an accounting firm or been around accounting firms that have, either got to the end of their life cycle. They're basically based around one person. And then the way to retire, the succession planning is to sell the book of business as opposed to have somebody take over that kind of work. This is especially true in like a sole proprietor tax preparer, but it happens with other larger firms that end up with one partner and haven't made that succession planning. And I guess I was surprised that there wasn't more of I guess a way other than selling your book. There wasn't more succession planning, or I guess in my mind before I got into the accounting realm, it always seemed kind of like the old lawyer movie where you're on partner track and they have the young hotshot lawyer or accountant picked out that's going to take over the firm at one point. But I often find that especially in smaller firms, that's not like really the case. They just kind of churn along until the person behind the firm is done working, basically.
Well, I think that's a different, that I relate that to a different angle I was thinking about on this when I was trying to kind of think about, again, me not having grown up in a family business, trying to understand, well, what is unique about the dynamic of a family business to this particular question or this issue. And I think what it might be is that, and which may relate partly to what you're talking about, AJ, um, is that in the family business context, the author was basically presenting this idea that in order for people to have a shared understanding, they had to have these like deep conversations or these events that would allow them to develop that shared understanding. And I think that the caveat to that might be that there is a different path to having almost a shared understanding, and that is two business owners who operate separate businesses but maybe are similar kinds of businesses and have similar experiences might come together, and there's maybe a chance that they have a similar or shared understanding of some things because they both have operated a similar business, right? Or two professionals, like two doctors or two lawyers or two accountants who've operated businesses or worked in their professions at the same level might come together and very efficiently have a shared understanding without doing a lot of deep questioning of each other because of the similar experiences that they've had. And so that made me think, well, that might be kind of the issue with a family business, because if you're in a non-family business, you kind of take advantage of those efficiencies, right? When you go to hire your executive team, you look for people who have experience in your industry or in your or professional experience. If you're looking to hire a CFO, for example, you hire somebody with the right professional qualifications. That may not be exactly true in a family business. I would wager there's a lot of family businesses out there with CFOs that don't have the same background and qualifications of non-family business CFOs. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're just somebody's kid or somebody's uncle or whatever, right? Or somebody's parent maybe or whatever. And so, and so I think that what that then means is, well, whoever that CFO is or whoever that executive is that's a family member, they don't come into the business and face business problems with a background of similar experiences that they can draw from for shared understanding. So that highlights the importance of them asking and of kind of what this author was getting at, that they need these events, right? They need these deep questioning and these events that allow them to get that deep understanding. So here's how I think that relates to what you're talking about. In a small accounting firm, from my experience, it's actually the case, accounting, you basically have like, it's like these two different things in terms of doing the accounting and running the business of an accounting firm. And it's quite possible to be very good at being the accountant and doing the accounting. And depending on how the firm operates, you may never really get a lot of experience in running the accounting firm. And so I think that small accounting firm owner, that they have this proposition, right? Do they invest in the time, or similar to what this author was talking about, creating those experiences where they can develop that common understanding with that person who's good at accounting, but maybe has never been a business owner. That's one route. The alternative route is that you don't do that and you just sell it off to somebody else who has already been a business owner or other, who already has kind of a shared understanding, and that you don't have to provide that kind of background or training to, because for whatever their background is, they have developed that shared understanding. So I think that's what I took from it, and how it relates to kind of what you're talking about.
100%. Yeah.
Although, to be clear, the author never got into that. I mean, the author was all in on the topic of you need to create these events that would create these opportunities to question and develop a shared understanding. They never presented the alternative that I'm presenting, which is perhaps you could have a shared understanding just from having similar experiences outside of working with those people.
And I guess the reason why I don't see it, like, for me, if I was to build a business or whatever, I would want to pass that on to somebody I thought that would, it's almost like you want to sell your house to somebody that would enjoy it as much as you have, or something like that. But some people don't view or don't hold, I guess, an emotional attachment with their work like that. And so it is probably easier just to sell it off like an asset, like you have a building or a car or something like that,
Well, and I think what you just said, that is exactly why the authors, because in the family business context, that is like this, that is the presumption, right? It's like, this is a family business. It's going to go to family. We're not going to go out and look for people who have similar experience. So that's why the author, I think that is the piece that why they put it in the context of a family business, why that the way they talked about it, that's the part that was unique to a family business, was the fact that they didn't bring up the possibility of getting people with similar experiences outside, because it's a family business. You don't go to the outside. You just look for a family member who you can pass this off onto. And to your point, I mean, it comes back to what we were saying earlier. What we see in common is a lot of small businesses, even though they're not literally family, kind of operate like families. So a lot of us kind of think that way about our small businesses anyway, even though we're not literally related by blood.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely just say from my experience that, in the companies that I've worked at, that happens. It just becomes the case that the company starts to think like the company, and it starts to act like a family, even though it's not. And so, yeah, until you start getting comfortable bringing in outside people to get a fresh perspective, then you're not going to get the same kind of, view on things that you would if you were it felt good bringing in, regularly bringing in non-family members. So yeah, kind of on the topic of small business, I've got another article we can look at, an article in Reuters called Over 80% of U.S. small businesses expect longer impact of pandemic, according to a survey. And so there is a company called Veeam that is like a money transmitter kind of company, but recently they've been able to, they were taking part in the PPP loans, processing applications on behalf of clients for the PPP loans. And as part of that, what they did is they did a survey that allowed the small business owners to kind of give their outlook on the economy and what they think is going to happen. And so what they found is what we might have expected that they would find, is that things are pretty bleak right now. And so 90% of the companies that they surveyed are bracing for economic slowdown. 65% of them had submitted applications for aid. But one of the things that they found was interesting is that there was surprising resilience among small businesses as they've been pivoting to do different things to try to brace themselves for this. And so a lot of what you would think you would see, which is that small businesses would struggle with being shut down, they've found ways to persist because they're able to pivot and because they're able to change what they do more effectively or more quickly than larger businesses. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. One of the other things it brought up was that, as you would expect, liquidity was a key pain point. But even though, so people are trying to take on more credit, they're trying to decrease operating expenses and whatnot. But even with all of that, it turned out that a quarter of businesses were still investing in new technology in hopes that they could better prepare themselves for the long-term effects of this whole coronavirus. And so I guess what I wanted to ask is, kind of now that we're further into the pandemic, like, how do you advise a business kind of dealing between, if they're looking at shuttering or pivoting without knowing the future? How do you advise a business on when it's right to pivot versus when it's right to shutter and kind of give in to the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a hard, I guess that's a hard thing to advise on. I think the one thing I would say is just that I think the recovery effort is, and the economy, it's going to be a slow go. Like, I don't think we're going to see this major bounce back that everyone is expecting to happen immediately. And I think it's going to take a long time for people to feel comfortable making purchases outside of necessities. You know, I see that very much so, that, you know, every time you turn on the news is about unemployment, economic insecurity, and that drives a real like wedge into most people on expenditures outside of necessities. And so if you're operating in a business that isn't deemed essential, if you're outside of food, shelter, clothing, stuff like that, and you're more in the luxury brand, or, you know, kind of on that, what do they call it, you know, sin tax stuff, or any of the, you know, externalities, technology, toys, stuff like that. I think that those industries, especially in the travel industry and stuff like that, might see a slower climb back up, you know. And so I think it's market, you know, depends on your market segment for your business. But I think it's, you know, like you said, it's completely up in the air how this all goes. But if, you know, if I was a betting man, I would bet that this is going to be a slow climb back into a normal, quote unquote, normal spending market.
I like answers that are not, I think this answer about when is the right time to pivot and should you go all in on a pivot, to me, I feel like I think you can answer it from the standpoint of, does it actually hurt anything to make that pivot? Is that pivot something that maybe you were putting off that would have been good for your business anyway, right? And so I think about that from examples of like most retail going online. I think that, you know, it's been true before the coronavirus crisis that having an online presence and being able to sell through online is a important part of your revenue stream, and should be an important part of your revenue stream to be long-term successful and sustainable as a retail operation. And or alternatively, if you're in a consumer good business, having a direct to consumer stream that goes straight to the consumer through online, some kind of online e-commerce platform, as part of your revenue stream, as opposed to just selling in big box stores or just selling in to wholesalers or distributors, has been an important strategic kind of anchor point for consumer products now for many years. And so, you know, a lot of times what companies have found is that it's it was still very difficult to make it as big as they wanted to make it just with direct to consumer. And so, you know, it was still true that in order to become really kind of a big name player, you had to have a good wholesale and distribution game plan, and you had to have, and if you were the kind of product that would be in a big box store, that was something that you'd want to achieve as well. But anytime you look at a consumer good company and you look, and if they've got a strong direct to consumer brand and revenue stream, you look at that, and that's a great asset. And it was a great asset before the current crisis, and so it would be a great asset during and after it, right? And so I think for those companies that are looking at that and saying, well, is it time to pivot to, like, if I'm a consumer good company and I didn't have a direct to consumer channel, a robust direct to consumer channel, and I'm scratching my head right now wondering, should I pivot to that? I think the answer is unequivocally yes. And because it doesn't hurt you, right? I mean, even if your brick and mortar presence comes back as a viable business in the next 12 to 18 months, and you're able to do well there too, how does it hurt you to develop your direct to consumer business right now online? It doesn't, right? It only serves to help you. So I guess my philosophy on that is you should be going all in on it just in case, because who knows on the other side what's going to happen. What we do know for sure is that direct to consumer through e-commerce is a thing, and it is a place for you to make money. It was before the crisis, it is during the crisis, and it will be after the crisis. So why not pivot to going all in on something like that, right? And I think we're going to have other articles where we talk about here, or another article where we talk about professional service firms and working at home. But that would be another example of, it was something that we could have done before the crisis that a lot of companies are benefiting from. And why not? Why waste? You know what they say, that whole thing that we say, you know, never waste a good crisis. Why waste a good crisis? Was that Churchill who said that? Why waste a good, you know, don't never waste a good crisis. Why waste a good crisis here, right? There's things that we probably should be doing for our businesses. So if the question is, should we go all in and do them? Yeah, do them. They're good for you anyway. Do them.
Well, and I think exactly to your point, Ty, you can probably ask yourself the question, is the pivot going to do one of those things that my business should be doing anyway? Diversifying revenue streams, bringing in is the pivot something I should have done a long time ago? Like you said, going digital or something like that. I think it really depends on the pivot. Now, if you're going from like a yoga studio to financial advice to somebody, you might rethink that pivot. But, if it makes sense for your business and it's going to, like hopefully strengthen it, you got to kind of put all your eggs in the basket there if you're fighting to keep your head above water,
So to kind of summarize, it kind of ultimately boils down to how likely you were going to do that pivot already anyway, and then an analysis of kind of what the barriers to entry are of that pivot, and can we sustain those costs needed to make those changes. And so as long as those two are in place, as long as the business was already going to do something like this and we can afford those costs, then at that situation, it makes sense to pivot, is kind of what it sounds like we're finding. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, absolutely. But I have to say, on AJ's example, as far-fetched as it sounds, the yoga studio that gives financial advice, there actually was a business like that here in Southwest Portland where I'm at. There was a business, and unfortunately it did go out, but I enjoyed part of the business because this business did this. They did personal financial planning. They also were doing some kind of spiritual awareness stuff, which included some yoga type thing as well. So they had like yoga classes and all that, but they were also doing personal financial planning. But the part of the business that those aren't parts of the business I would have been into. The part of the business that I was into is they also sold pie. So you could go get a slice of pie and a cup of coffee. So very, you thought it was a far-fetched pivot, AJ, but believe it or not, this is Portland.
This all sounds like the build-up to a punchline. So I cannot wait to hear I don't know if you want to call out that business, but I would love to hear the name of this business and how it ties all of those things together, because it better.
Well, I actually don't know the official name, and so they might, if somebody sees this and knows this, they might put it in I always called it the Sacred Pie, but I don't think that's actually what it was called.
If we're talking about diverse revenue streams, you've got yoga, financial planning, and pie. Like, I don't think you get much more diverse revenue streams than that. Like,
yes, you're feeding your soul in every way possible.
They went under. So what do we know?
Yeah. All right. On that note, all right, I got another article here. This one is actually the one that Ty just mentioned here. It's from Accounting Today, and it's in surprise, surprise, it's about COVID-19. But the title of the article is "Taking Stock of Your Firm: What Has Changed and What Will Change." And so this article is all about accounting firms, accounting and financial firms. And so one of the things they said is, of course, culture is everything is the first thing they say. And so they talk about a commitment to culture, revisiting your culture, making sure it's, the inclusive, fun place that wants to work. Remote is here to stay is the other one that they're talking about. And I think we could probably talk about this for a while, but I used to work in a firm that was not remote. I heard from people that are still working there that they had to make the switch to being remote in some capacity because of this, and they'll continue to be remote after it. It's something that they could have done a long time ago, but they were forced to do it. And so I think it reaffirms what we've been saying on this podcast for a while, that the pandemic is a great accelerator, and remote work is one of those accelerations. And then it talks about business as a partnership, and it talks about kind of a proactive focus on the clients, the partnership between the clients and the firm itself. And they also talk about then, the staff and the partnership that happens there too. And so I just wanted to get it from you guys, if there's something that maybe missed, or if they're off base on these? I mean, I have a feeling we probably all agree, but I'd like to hear what you guys thought.
Yeah, I think the way I've been talking to a lot of other CPA firms, and for the audience members who don't know, AJ and Charlie and we were part of a firm called TCA that does CFO advisory work. So we don't do the traditional CPA firm work. So we network a lot and work hand in hand with other CPA firms who do the traditional work, the tax returns, the audits, the typical kind of CPA services. And so because of that, I mean, that's my lifeline. So I've been staying in touch as much as possible with CPA firms. And that's one of the questions that I've been asking each of these firms is, okay, when the state opens the offices back up, what are you going to do? What's your plan? Do you call everyone back into the office immediately, or how do you plan on handling that? And every single one, and I've asked this question the last week and a half to 4 or 5 firms, and every single one didn't know. They didn't know the answer. They kind of, I mean, I think the way they answered it of not knowing, it seemed pretty clear that the idea of calling everyone back the day the government allows you to was not going to happen, that's not the page that they were on. But did this mean that they were going to have everyone working remotely indefinitely? Were they going to let people work remotely indefinitely? Or, in some cases, what I was hearing was they might leave it up to the people to decide kind of what worked best for them now that they've kind of figured out how they can actually do remote work. That's what they're looking at is kind of leaving that option open in some cases. In other cases, what I thought was an interesting strategy was having office days where people were supposed to come in on certain days, but otherwise would work from home. And I don't know, the part that I didn't quite follow about that strategy is if that had anything to do with social distancing, or if that simply was people like working at home now, but we still need them in the office to meet with each other occasionally, if that's what was driving that thought. But yeah, that's I guess I don't personally have a strong opinion on this. Our organization has been kind of work at home or work hand in hand at the client site from the beginning. So we don't have a centralized office for us anyway. So I don't have an opinion to levy on this other than just to report what I'm hearing from the firms that I've talked to.
I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and to follow up on what you said, I'm wondering if the response of those CPA firms based on they don't know is less about maybe like their feeling on it, but more against like worker revolt. If you just told everybody they got to be back Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, fight traffic to work at home, versus work at home, if you just wouldn't have not mutiny, but some really offset employees because they've, I was able to get my work done, but now I got to come back into the office,
Well, I can give you my opinion on that piece in terms of what I feel about what our government has done. And I try not to get too political most of the time, but I think in most situations, anything like this, as a business, what you want to be able to do, what you should be able to do, is to rely on government standards and say that, look, we're following government standards as to how we're doing things. And so, if employees are ultimately upset or concerned that maybe you're doing something that risks them, and ultimately as a business, I hate to say it, but we're always concerned as business owners that we might get sued, right? Whether it's by customers or employees or whatever, right? And usually our only protection against that is, are we following community standards? And community standards are generally set by the government. The problem that we have is the communication from the federal down to the state governments has been so piss poor and so disjoint and so obviously and evidently not necessarily science-based that I think as a business owner, it's hard to feel that you can safely say, well, I followed a certain course of action because that's what the government said to do, and that's going to fly. I mean, like, I seriously wonder that. I wonder, well, even if the state, and probably not Oregon, because Oregon's much more conservative on this issue, but if I was operating in one of those states where they've been pretty liberal about opening up and doing some pretty radical stuff, if I was operating a business in one of those states, the question that would come to my mind is even if the state said that it was okay to open up and I opened up, and that ultimately, that somebody getting sick or injured or hurt could be traced back to my actions, would I really be able to say that I relied on the advice of the state or on the federal government administration? Or is it, or would I be held liable because the courts would say, ha ha ha, how could you possibly rely on those people? Of course, any reasonable person would think that they're just talking nonsense. And so, I mean, it's really turned it on its head. We don't really seem to have an authoritative figure we can actually rely on from a legal liability standpoint. And that's a real problem for business. When government doesn't do its job and act as a reasonable authority on these issues, it creates uncertainty for business. And that's, I think a lot of times people on both sides of the aisle, they think that business wants a particular answer. Yeah, if we get to choose, we want the answer that's going to generate the highest revenue with the least costs, right? But we live in the real world, and in the real world, I don't necessarily get to choose what my answers are. So the second best thing that I want from government and politics is some certainty, right? Uncertainty is the worst thing for business. And so the answer doesn't matter as much as having some certainty that is well defined. And I think that's a real problem for businesses as we're opening up, that the way this is happening doesn't create a lot of certainty for businesses.
Well, and I think it's also important to kind of note the individualistic nature of the question being asked. Like, when it makes sense to go back to work, it might be one thing for one person and it might be another thing for another person. And, that person is okay to stay at home and willing to deal with the communication issues that can cause, but is, more health anxious about the virus. And so doesn't want to, so I think regulation is only good at imposing kind of the floors and the boundaries that we act within, but that ultimately it's such an individual question of when does it make sense to get back to work, that we're always going to see contention on this. And it's never going to be a clear, okay, this is the time. And I think the other thing is that we're going to turn it on and say everybody can go back to work when we think it's safe, but that action in and of itself is going to cause people to continue getting sick. And so that then kind of changes the factors in the risk equation of whether or not it makes sense to go back to work. And so, I think it's an individual decision that each firm and each individual in it has to kind of wrestle with and do their own analysis to determine what makes sense for them. But I don't think we're going to see any kind of consensus on this anytime soon because of the nature of the question,
Completely agree. And I think, as people start going back to work, I think they're going to start asking the same questions. Is it safe? Is it legal to, like from a business owner's perspective, is it legal to tell my employees to come back to work? Or am I, like Ty said, putting myself out for liability on that? So, and I think that's coupled with the fact that like employees probably now want to work from home if it's possible. And not only that though, those that were laid off and now are being called back and they have the option to sit at home for as much or more money than they were making in a paycheck, that makes it even more difficult to get a workforce up and moving again, with these expanded unemployment benefits. So it's that governmental swing between being, having the incentive to work, but then also having like clear rules and definitions for what a business is liable for, but also what, the general public can do. And depending on who you ask on what day it is, it's either the county, state, federal, you have no idea. I mean, just before this podcast, we were talking about doing the in-person thing, and we probably did 15 minutes of research to even figure out if that was a viable option, So I can't imagine if we were talking about having people coming back into like an office area and what the liability or what the rules are about that. So, I mean, if we're spending a half hour just looking up if we can do the podcast in person, I can't imagine trying to open up a restaurant, coffee shop, or, even an accounting firm with a brick and mortar presence,
Well, and it's one thing to kind of analyze the question of once government says it's okay to go back to work, is it actually okay? That's one potential question we can ask. But the other question is, should that even be the decision that causes that to become an option? Like we're looking at it as if government says it's okay, then will people want to wait a few more or whatever before they go back to work? But in another article that I read that's on the same topic, it was talking about how I guess I'll just go into it. But yeah, as a Washington Post article about how Tesla has filed suit in response to coronavirus restrictions. And so here we have kind of the opposite thing happening where Alameda County has tried to shut down Tesla and keep it from opening. And it's disagreeing with that order completely and just trying to reopen and get its people back to the workforce. And it argues that their attempts to keep things shut down are contrary to the governor, the president, and our constitutional freedoms and just plain common sense, according to Elon Musk's tweet. And so it's a contentious issue that even once the government says it's okay, that's one discussion. But yeah, people are fighting to get back in there already, even before that day has come. And so, yeah.
When you mention Elon Musk, and I don't really know what to think of that. I haven't, he's not somebody I followed in great detail. I mean, I know, of course, that he has Tesla and SpaceX and all that. And he was really popular. The Joe Rogan podcast that had him on was really popular in a lot of things, but I've never kind of tried to figure out, I've never really spent enough time listening to him to really understand him. So I was a little bit, I would say I was disappointed in the sense that I think what I thought in my mind of him is, oh, he's kind of a great American entrepreneur, and perhaps, this doesn't change that framework for him. But I felt it was a little bit disappointing that kind of pushing that he needs to open the Tesla plant just from the standpoint of how really important in the grand, across all the things that need to open in the economy is the Tesla plant, putting himself in the forefront, in the front and center of fighting a battle of we need to get the country open, getting the country open, talking about getting a Tesla plant open doesn't seem like the poster child for why we need to get the country open. I guess let me say it that way.
Yeah, totally. Especially not right now when driving is probably down overall. And the other thing I thought that was kind of frustrating about it is that one of his kind of statements about it was that the county levels are the county level orders are inconsistent, but that state orders should supersede them. And so I guess as I read it, what went through my head is, does he actually believe that, or instead of that, is he just cherry picking which government happens to be saying the thing which he agrees with the most? And at which point, how do you juggle that? How do you juggle when three overlapping jurisdictions are giving conflicting guidance? And can we just pick whichever one we like the most and say that should override, and then cite the Constitution as to why that's okay, that we should do that? And so it just seemed silly to me, and seemed like something that maybe he wouldn't be saying if it didn't happen to be the case that that government agreed with him versus the other one not.
Yeah, it just felt incredibly self-serving is all. I guess that's why I felt disappointed about it. It just felt like self-absorbed, not necessarily self-serving, self-absorbed, because I hesitate to question somebody's motivations in the sense that he may indeed believe that what he's talking about in his particular predicament is a fight worth fighting, not only for his company but for the concept in the country. But it just seems like the wrong fight to fight. I guess that's what made me disappointed about the situation, is that what I thought I knew about him before was that he worked on big problems and was focused on big important issues, and getting his plant open in this situation doesn't seem like it meets that criteria to me.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's it's hard to tell, because he's a very intelligent man, of course. He's an engineer at heart, and he's created a car company from nothing, and then a space company and a solar company, and more power to him. but I'm wondering if, like, I guess his knee-jerk reaction sounds to me kind of out of touch with what's going on right now. And I don't know. I'm not on the inside. I can't say. But just my opinion, it sounds a little bit out of touch with kind of, I guess, the sentiment or the nationwide sentiment now. Now, history will tell whether he's right or wrong, whether I think we're overreacting and we can go back. But I would just say that if I was in his position, I would just kind of proceed with measured caution because, everybody is watching. He does have a large target on his back to fall. And I guess the part that I was kind of, surprised about was the risk to all of this. And not that he's, he probably has a very large risk appetite, but just the risk associated with making this push. You're talking about regulatory risk. You're talking about, of course, legality risk. If your workers get hurt or want to sue you, you're in California. I mean, it's a very law tight kind of state. And worker friendly state. And so, I'm just really surprised at the risk that's there, and pushing the boundaries on this, I guess.
Totally. And just to kind of piggyback on that, I mean, one of his specific claims was that Alameda County had violated due process. And so it's like that I'm kind of thinking the same thing you are, which is like, as I'm reading it, it's like, there is no due process in the case of a pandemic where everyone is dying. Like, you don't get to have some of the same luxuries. And especially when the move on the government side is towards safety, right? So it's like due process just doesn't seem to apply the same way when the stakes are what they are. And so, I agree.
Well, and I think that risk thing, what you're talking about, AJ, I think that is another angle on what was disappointing to me about it, because he does take outsized risks, but the outsized risks that I've perceived that he takes previously, I looked at them as being almost heroic risks, and in the sense that he takes a lot of risk to his personal reputation in pushing for a journey to Mars and pushing forward on the electric vehicle. And whether he's right or wrong, like, in this day and age, he takes a lot of risk in terms of his finances and his reputation and everything. And that's a lot of personal risk that he takes, right? But this is different because in this endeavor, whether he's right or wrong, and I don't know that he's wrong, but it is that risk point, right? Is that we don't know for sure that he's right either. And so he's not just risking his personal reputation or money here. He's risking people's lives, the employees, and really, if that factory is a significant part of Alameda County, he's risking the entire community with his actions on that. And so to me, that's a whole different level of, it's different. It's not the same kind of heroic risk that he's taken on other things. He's now risking other people in the community with his positions. And that just seems a little bit self-absorbed to me.
Totally. I agree.
All right. My last article I got here is actually, consumer prices post biggest decline. This is Market Watch since 2008 as coronavirus put clamps on inflation. So 2008, the Great Recession, CPI took a huge plunge then. CPI, Consumer Price Index, this year, or actually in 2020, since the pandemic has also crashed. So it says that economists polled by MarketWatch also forecast a future almost 1% drop. And the prices of gas have gone down. The pace of inflation over the last 12 months have slowed to 0.3% from 1.5 in March and 2.5 at the start of 2020. So we were really at an inflationary rate that was really quick compared to the last maybe 20, 30 years. And then, so what has happened is gas prices have crashed, but the other part of that, and clothes, auto insurance, hotel rooms, plane tickets, all of that has tanked because of the stay-at-home orders. But some prices that have increased and that are in high demand are, of course, groceries. Those jumped 2.6%. And then real high percentage because of the viral outbreaks are meat packing plants. And so the cost of chicken and beef have surged 5.8% and 3.7% respectively. And so, and in a bit of surprise, cost of home ownership and rent rose about 2.2%. So it's kind of all over the place as far as that, but for sure, consumer price index have tanked. And so they say the big picture is inflation is falling, is unlikely to be a problem for a long time, despite piles of new government spending and debt. And so even though the government is issuing all this money and printing money at a rapid pace and handing it out, which usually causes inflation because of the way that America is spending, it's reined back in inflation. And so this isn't usually a place where we kind of touch on in the economics of the US, but one thing I thought was interesting when I was reading this article and thinking about it is pricing strategy behind going forward, and how I think after this pandemic, and we talked about this earlier in the show, you talk about, the recovery of the economy is going to be slow. I'm just wondering how much, and I think, luxury spending or things like that, depending on which industry you are, you're going to have a really hard time climbing back out of this. And so I'm wondering if there's anything that you guys kind of in this area either experience in your personal life where you're paying a lot of money for things that, you may thought, why is this more price? Or from like a business standpoint, do you see this impact of the coronavirus lasting and how you can kind of see that impacting the businesses going forward?
Yeah, I would say I'm fortunate or unfortunate to be, and I'll say why I may be unfortunate, but I'm fortunate financially to be somewhat unaffected by these kind of numbers. I remember when I'm a big meat eater. You look at me, you'll be surprised, right, that I like to eat meat. So I'm a meat eater. And more importantly, also one of the statistics on there looking at me, it's probably not going to surprise you that between the different kinds of meat that I eat, I would prefer beef over chicken. So I was pretty happy to see that the beef cost didn't go up as much as the chicken cost. I was like, yeah, that chicken cost went way up, but I eat beef, so I'm good, right? But the reality is, for me, the financial reality, so it's just me and my wife, and you don't eat that much of groceries when it's just two of you adults at home, that kind of thing. So to me, these are relatively small increases. And I think about it that way because I remember when I saw in the news, because I am a meat eater, meat's like, I got to have it. And every single day I have to have meat. And my wife's Chinese. And for most Chinese, eating meat's a big thing too. So particularly pork. And so when we saw in the news that, there's these problems with the meat packing plants and it's going to cause prices to spike. There was a part of me that was like, oh crap, we're not going to get our meat. What are we going to do, kind of thing. But when I saw the article that you picked and I saw those differences, I'm like, I don't know why I was worried. Those kind of differences are not, for the amount that we buy, those kind of differences are not going to be hugely affected to us. Now, I say the reason why that story for me, there's some unfortunate piece to it is, I'm not a family man. I don't have kids. That's why it doesn't affect me that much. I don't have a big family that I'm trying to feed. I think about my younger brother who has 4 boys. The grocery bill's a big thing. It's a big thing. Or Charlie's got kids. The grocery bill, I'm sure, is a big thing. So this is a totally different issue when you've got a family with kids than if you're just what do they call us? Dual income, dinks. Dual income, no kids. When you're just a couple of dinks, this kind of thing is not that, doesn't really affect us that much. But for you family guys, I imagine you're thinking about it.
Well, I just want to say, so a couple things. So number one, I'm a huge meat eater too. So I'm with you on that 100%. I love both chicken and beef. So I'm kind of torn on that piece of it. As far as the kids goes, my kids are little enough that getting them to eat meat consistently is a gigantic issue in and of itself. So that's already going to be a challenge right there. But the thing that's been kind of the most surprising for me that I didn't foresee happening out of this whole pandemic is how much my mom texts me about how much beef I have or how much meat I have. My parents are constantly writing me like, hey, Charlie, we know you eat meat, so I just want to make sure that you're stocked up, and if you need any beef, you can kind of come over and get some. And that's just like something that wasn't even on my mind until the prices. I was like, man, beef prices must be getting really high if my mom is texting me. So that's been my experience. What do you think, AJ?
Well, I'm vegan, so that really doesn't play. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not vegan.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, what?
No, I'll tell you what it has done. It's really changed my gift buying kind of thing. In fact, Tiffany's birthday is coming up, my wife's birthday. And so for her birthday, I'm getting her a 12-pack of toilet paper and 2 steaks. And basically, that's she's totally excited about it. So yeah, those are luxury buys. Let me tell you.
So, you're celebrating on the way in and the way out.
Yeah. Right. Oh my God, I'll use that one. What do you mean you're disappointed? It's a celebration in and a celebration out, and I got double ply. Don't worry. I guess my heart goes out to people that, I'm in kind of the same boat as Ty. Like, even though I have grandkids and stuff, we don't have anybody that lives with us. I don't have to pay for those little guys. So, as far as our consumption goes, you're right. I mean, I can pay $30 for a steak. That's fine. But it wasn't too long ago that $30 was my monthly allowance or weekly allowance for food. I haven't always had a really good paying job. And so, yeah, I mean, I do remember those days when a price increase on beef like that or chicken would have been a really hard thing. The other thing I think about is restaurants. You have all these to-go restaurants and everything. We're going to see a consumer price increase in what we're paying for delivery food. They're going to have to pass the increase on to the consumer. And so, even though inflation's down, you're still going to be paying probably more for produced food to support your local businesses. So restaurants are already a really hard business to run. And if you're talking about increasing cost in the, already spoilable, cost that you carry as cost of goods sold, it makes it even more difficult to work on those razor thin margins. So that was the thing that I thought about, are those restaurants, bars, and kind of those low margin businesses that rely on food or consumer goods to keep going. How much of a struggle it's going to be for them and for lower income families. And that's, I think, the real thing about this is, that bottom half of society that really struggles paycheck to paycheck. That's where this hits the most. All right. Thanks for watching the None of Our Businesses podcast roundtable. Make sure you smash the like button, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and catch us next week for more roundtable discussions on current news articles. Thanks so much for watching. See you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you.